Back, you're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our discussion with Dr. Mills Soko. He's, of course, the Director for Policy in the new political party, Agang. Dr. Soko, let's talk about the machine that Agang is going to put in place to fight the election. We know, of course, that there's a very big difference between expressing support for a party and getting voters out to come into the voting booth and make their cross against your party. You are very new, as you've said. You are only going to be sorting out your leadership after the elections. Are you satisfied that the volunteer system that you have going is sufficient to actually get voters out in large enough numbers to put you on the map and to get your representatives in the National Assembly?
Yes, I am satisfied. We started with a very small team in February, but we've made enormous progress since then. When you look at our leadership team, we have expanded. We now have a campaign director, a top executive that we recruited from ABSA. We have a communications director. We have a field director. We've now recruited provincial organizers in the various provinces. We have built up a very strong and solid volunteer network. And when you looked at, if you look at the launch that we had on Saturday, all the people that were there came from the 9 provinces that constitute our country. So we are building a very strong volunteer network. We are also registering members across the spectrum. As a matter of fact, on Saturday alone, we registered 2,000 volunteers, and we also had hundreds of people registering for membership. Now, we're working very hard to build a campaign structure. We're receiving good advice on how to build a campaign structure. We're working very hard to refine our campaign strategy, which will unveil soon. We already have fragments of that. We'll unveil in the next weeks or so. And yes, I'm satisfied with where we are. We have grown, and there is greater recognition of the Agang brand in South Africa today than we heard in February. And I think we are making enormous progress.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's a good game that you're talking, and you certainly sound very confident. But let's look at the actual numbers. We know the Democratic Alliance has an excellent machine. It manages to get its supporters out, which is largely concentrated in the racial minorities. The African National Congress has a phenomenal machine, deep footprint. It brings rural communities out. The ANC's PR percentage of the national vote has not dropped beyond below 70%. Take us through the branch structures, if you have any, Dr. Soko. How big are they? The DA doesn't necessarily believe in branch structures, but my understanding is it's made up of around about 25 people. The ANC, you have to have a minimum of 100 people to have a branch. The ANC has 1.4 million volunteers that it's putting in the field. Take us through your infrastructure. How big is your branches? How many do you have? Or are you only going to be able to tell me that in September?
Well, I can tell you now, we have now established what we call campaign committees, ward committees across the country. And if you followed the launch on Saturday, a declaration was read whereby, as leadership of the party, we were mandated to begin the work of building the party. And we have urged our members to go back and establish these campaign committees that will be based on a party architecture that we agreed on as a party. And this party architecture will be based on the IEC, Electoral Act. And these structures will be set up in every voting district across the provinces. And our members are already doing that. And today we've been fielding queries from our members who have gone back in terms of how to deal with this. Now, I can't give you exact figures today, but I can tell you that, given where we've come from, we are growing by leaps and bounds, and we'll be able to give specific figures in the coming weeks. We are aiming to have, at least by the time we have an election next year, 5 million volunteers, stroke members. That is what we're aiming at, and we have people working around the clock helping us to do this using technology and using on-the-ground recruitment strategies. Our provincial organizers have been working very hard with our volunteers, to recruit members, and we'll be able to give you figures on that. We are not the ANC, we are not the DA. They're more established than us. We're new kids on the block, but I can assure you that we are making progress in terms of building our presence on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Soko, there's always talk on the establishment of a grand coalition. Newspapers are already speculating that there are serious behind closed door discussions between yourselves and other political parties about potential coalitions after the elections. I've spoken with some of the smaller parties and of course the DA, and all of them suggest that you guys are not averse to coming together. Before we talk about coalitions after the elections, let's talk about why Agang decided to go it alone. There isn't that many philosophical differences between yourselves and, let's say, the Democratic Alliance. Why did you not join forces and build a very solid machine that can really take on the ANC at the polls?
I don't agree with you when you say there are no philosophical differences between us and the DA.
Okay, which are the philosophical differences, Professor Soko, rather Dr. Soko, which are the key policy differences between yourselves and the Democratic Alliance, for example? Because
philosophical differences are not only about policy. Philosophical differences are not only about policy. You know, there are many issues that we discussed with the DA as part of an attempt to establish a relationship. And I'm not going to go into those issues except to say that the talks broke down, and part of the breakdown has to do with the conceptual differences that we had as Agang and the DA. So I'm not going to go into that at this stage, but there are differences between us and the DA. But of course, that does not mean that we are averse, as you said, to exploring ways of interacting and working closely with other parties, because we do believe in the need to consolidate political opposition in South Africa. We do need to realign the political landscape in South Africa. That is a very important guiding principle of Agang. We have been involved in discussions with several political parties, and we are looking at ways in which we can work together. These talks are ongoing. Given the sensitivity of those talks, you know, I cannot reveal anything right now, but we are very keen to explore ways in which you can work with those parties, and that relationship, of course, will have to be based on agreed political principles and political objectives. So yes, I do want to confirm that we are involved in these discussions and will continue to have these discussions before and after the elections next year.
Mm-hmm. The fact that you are not able to go into a coalition or a merger with the Democratic Alliance, does it have a lot to do with the fact that the DA is perceived to be a party of the past, a party led by whites, a party who has the minority group's interests? And are you having discussions, for example, with black-led parties, for example, with the UDM, with COPE, and several of the other parties that are on the ballot at the moment? Is the issue around race a deciding factor for who you go into political alliances with?
No. You know, we've spoken to the DA. We've spoken to other political parties, some of which we have mentioned, and we are continuing to do so. And it's not so much about race. You know, I think that is a very reductionist way of looking at it. We're looking at a whole range of issues around leadership, around political principles, around organizational changes, around branding issues, around finances, around strategic objectives. So there's a whole range of issues that are on the table. And these are the kind of issues one would expect when you deal with issues of this nature. And there have been some differences on those issues, but there have also been some agreements on other issues. And the purpose of the discussions that we're having with the various political parties are designed to bridge those differences and to enable us to, to realize our objective of realigning the political landscape in South Africa. Let me say also again that we are communicating with leaders across the various sectors in our society. So it's not only political parties or political leaders that we're talking to, but we're also talking to business leaders, we're talking to civil society leaders, we're talking to people in academia, people in trade unions, people in... We want to build an inclusive party, a party that also recognizes the need for fresh leadership. So some of the people that will unveil in future are people that you've never heard of, but they're very good leaders, they're highly capable leaders, but you've never heard of. But there will also be some familiar faces, that you will see. So we were trying to draw on the strengths and the capabilities of South Africans as much as possible, irrespective of race, color, culture, and background.
Mm-hmm. I hear what you're saying, Dr. Soko, but let's, for example, take the coalition, let's say, that operated in the Western Cape at some point that allowed the Democratic Alliance to take control of the province. They were, for example, in an alliance with Freedom Front. Now, we know that the Freedom Front makes no apologies for the fact that it campaigns for Afrikaner interests as a group. Would the Agang, for example, go into an alliance with the Freedom Front? The point that I'm trying to make here is, what are the deal breakers politically and philosophically and from a policy point of view that will either decide for you whether you go in with another political party or whether you oppose them? And I want to ask specifically on the question of affirmative action. For a lot of parties, including the Democratic Alliance, affirmative action is a political hot potato that they have not wanted to embrace. To what extent is the question of affirmative action, for example, a deal breaker for a relationship between yourselves and the Democratic Alliance?
Yeah, well, it's not only policy, as I said, there are other issues.
But let's answer my question, sir. Let's talk about the issue of affirmative action, because it is a very pertinent issue. And it is a point of difference between yourselves and the DA. So if you could answer the question.
Yeah, but let me put it this way. I'm answering your question because it's not just about policy, but it's about the broad strategic orientation. Now, I'm going to answer your question within that context. For us, it is very important for the parties that are interested in working with us to recognize the legacy of apartheid, the legacy of racial oppression, and the need for racial redress. That is very important for us. And that will include issues about economic opportunities, about education, about the need to recognize those scars, deep scars of apartheid. So that is very important. And then with regard to the Freedom Front, we've not had any discussions with the Freedom Front, but we are not supportive of the notion of a minority, as I can't remember how you described it. What some of the positions that they articulate. We're not comfortable with that. We're not supportive of that, and we have not had discussions with them yet.